It was August 17, 1966, the Mekong Delta, South Vietnam. Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 27th Infantry Regiment, was conducting a routine river crossing operation near the village of Kai Lay. The intelligence briefing had been clear: minimal enemy presence in the area. The river was considered relatively safe. The operation was classified as low risk. The company consisted of 120 soldiers, most of them young men on their first tour in Vietnam. They had been in country for 3 months. They had seen combat, but nothing that had prepared them for what was about to happen. The plan was straightforward: cross the river using inflatable rafts and establish a perimeter on the opposite bank. From there, they would sweep through a suspected Viet Cong supply route and interdict any enemy movement. The river at the crossing point was approximately 80 meters wide. The current was moderate. The water was murky brown, typical of the Mekong Delta, with visibility of perhaps 6 inches beneath the surface. The far bank was thick with vegetation, elephant grass, mangroves, and dense jungle that came right down to the water's edge. At 8:45 hours, the first raft pushed off from the bank carrying 12 soldiers. The soldiers scanned the opposite shore, weapons ready, expecting possible fire from the tree line. That's where ambushes came from. That's where the enemy was supposed to be. The raft reached the midpoint of the river, and that's when the impossible happened. The water itself erupted with gunfire, not from the far bank, not from concealed positions on shore, from the water, from beneath the surface. Muzzle flashes appeared just above the waterline, bullets tearing through the raft, ripping into soldiers who had no cover, no protection, no understanding of what was attacking them. Men screamed. The raft deflated. Soldiers tumbled into the water, some wounded, some dead, all of them in complete shock because rivers don't shoot. Rivers don't attack. The enemy is supposed to be on land, but the river was shooting back. And American troops, for perhaps the first time in the Vietnam War, encountered an enemy tactic so unexpected, so innovative, so utterly alien to their training that they literally froze in shock. The architect of water, the Viet Cong commander who developed the underwater combat positions, was Senior Colonel Nguyen Van Hue, a veteran who had fought against the French at Dien Bien Phu and had spent 20 years perfecting unconventional warfare tactics. Hue understood something fundamental about American military doctrine. American soldiers were trained to engage enemies on land. Their tactics, their weapons, their entire strategic mindset was oriented toward terrestrial combat. Even riverine warfare, which the Americans had developed during the Vietnam War, assumed the enemy would be on boats or on shore. What if the enemy was in the water itself? Not swimming, not using boats, but actually fighting from underwater positions that were invisible from the surface? Hue began experimenting with the concept in 1964. He knew that Vietnamese soldiers were comfortable in water. Many had grown up in the Mekong Delta. They could hold their breath for extended periods. They could operate in conditions that would be impossible for most Western soldiers, but fighting underwater presented enormous technical challenges. How do you breathe? How do you see? How do you fire weapons? How do you communicate? Heo spent 2 years developing solutions. The result was one of the most innovative tactical systems of the Vietnam War: the underwater combat bunker, the engineering of the impossible. The underwater combat positions were marvels of improvised engineering. They consisted of several components: breathing tubes, long bamboo tubes approximately 2 inches in diameter that extended from underwater positions to the surface. The tubes were camouflaged with vegetation to make them invisible from more than a few feet away. Soldiers could breathe through these tubes while remaining completely submerged. Underwater platforms, wooden platforms anchored to the riverbed in shallow water, typically 3-4 feet below the surface. Soldiers would stand on these platforms, their bodies completely underwater, breathing through the bamboo tubes. Weapon seals. Rifles were wrapped in waterproof coverings made from rubber or treated cloth. The covering was designed to be quickly torn away when the soldier surfaced to fire. Firing ports. Small gaps in water vegetation where soldiers could raise their weapons to fire. From the surface, these ports looked like natural breaks in the reeds. From underwater, they provided clear firing lanes. Communication system, a series of ropes connecting underwater positions. Soldiers could signal each other through tugs on the rope. One tug meant enemy approaching, 2 tugs meant prepare to fire, 3 tugs meant engage. The system was primitive but effective. It allowed Viet Cong soldiers to remain hidden underwater for hours, completely invisible to American reconnaissance, waiting for the perfect moment to attack. The training Viet Cong soldiers for underwater combat was brutal. Many soldiers couldn't adapt to the psychological stress of remaining submerged for extended periods, breathing through a narrow tube, unable to see or hear what was happening on the surface. The training took place in the rivers and canals of the Mekong Delta over several months. Soldiers practiced holding their breath, breathing through bamboo tubes, firing weapons immediately after surfacing from underwater. Most difficult was learning to maintain calm while submerged. The natural human response to being underwater is panic. Soldiers had to overcome this instinct. They had to learn to accept the darkness, the silence, the vulnerability of being unable to see or defend themselves until the moment of attack. One Viet Cong soldier who trained for underwater combat positions, Tran Van Min, described the experience in a post-war memoir. "The first time I tried to breathe through the bamboo tube underwater, I panicked. My brain was screaming that I was drowning. I surfaced immediately, coughing and terrified. It took weeks of practice before I could remain underwater calmly. I learned to trust the tube, to control my breathing, to ignore the feeling of being buried alive. Eventually, being underwater felt almost normal. The hardest part was waiting. You're underwater, in complete darkness, breathing through a tube, listening to sounds you can only half hear. You don't know if the enemy is coming. You don't know if your comrades are still there. You can only wait and trust that when the signal comes, you'll be able to surface and fight." The first attack, the underwater combat positions, were first used in a small ambush in June 1966. A 6-man Viet Cong team positioned themselves in a river crossing point used by American patrols. They waited underwater for 4 hours before an American patrol attempted to cross. The attack was devastatingly effective. The Americans had no idea the Viet Cong were present until the moment soldiers surfaced and opened fire at point-blank range. The patrol was decimated, with 8 killed and 5 wounded. The surviving Americans retreated, reporting that they had been ambushed by enemy forces who appeared out of the water itself. American intelligence initially dismissed this report as combat exaggeration. Rivers don't hide soldiers. The Americans assumed the Viet Cong had been concealed on shore and the panicked report had misidentified their location. But similar reports began accumulating. American units crossing rivers in the Mekong Delta were being ambushed by enemy forces that seemed to materialize from the water. Soldiers described seeing Viet Cong rising out of the river and firing before disappearing back beneath the surface. By August 1966, American military intelligence had to acknowledge that the Viet Cong had developed some kind of underwater combat capability, but they didn't understand how it worked or how to counter it. The August 17th ambush, the ambush of Charlie Company on August 17, 1966, was the largest and most successful use of underwater combat positions during the entire war. Colonel Hugh had positioned 45 Viet Cong soldiers in the river at the crossing point. They were arranged in 3 lines, one near each bank and one in the middle of the river. Each soldier was standing on an underwater platform, breathing through a bamboo tube, with their weapons sealed and ready. They had been in position for 6 hours when Charlie Company began their crossing. 6 hours of remaining perfectly still, breathing through narrow tubes, waiting in darkness. When the first American raft reached the middle of the river, the Viet Cong in the central position received the signal. 3 tugs on the communication rope. Engage. 15 Viet Cong soldiers surfaced simultaneously. They tore the waterproof coverings from their weapons. They opened fire at ranges of less than 10 meters. The Americans on the raft had no cover. They were sitting targets in an inflatable boat. The first raft was shredded in seconds. Soldiers tumbled into the water. Some were dead before they hit the water. Others were wounded and drowning. The survivors tried to swim to safety but were engaged by Viet Cong on both banks. The second raft, seeing the carnage, tried to turn back. But now the Viet Cong near the American bank surfaced and opened fire. The second raft was caught in crossfire from positions that shouldn't have existed. American soldiers on the bank opened return fire. But they were shooting at targets that kept disappearing beneath the water. As soon as a Viet Cong soldier emptied his magazine, he would duck beneath the surface, reload while underwater, and surface in a different location to fire again. The Americans couldn't establish effective fire control because the enemy positions kept moving. You can't target what you can't see. You can't suppress fire coming from beneath the water. The engagement lasted 17 minutes. By the time it ended, 23 American soldiers were dead, 31 were wounded, and the river crossing had been completely halted. The Viet Cong withdrew by simply sinking beneath the water and using underwater breathing tubes to move away from the ambush site. American commanders were baffled. How had the Viet Cong ambushed them from the middle of a river? Where had they hidden? How had they disappeared so completely? The shock and confusion. The psychological impact of the August 17th ambush was immediate and severe. American soldiers who had survived described feelings of complete helplessness. They had been trained to fight enemies on land. They had been trained to identify enemy positions and return fire. But how do you return fire against an enemy who is underwater? Private First Class David Miller, who survived the first raft's destruction, described the experience. I saw the water explode with muzzle flashes. My first thought was that we were being fired on from the far bank. But the fire was coming from the water itself. I saw a Viet Cong soldier standing in the middle of the river, chest deep in water, firing an AK-47. Then he ducked under and disappeared. I thought I was hallucinating. Rivers don't have soldiers in them. But then more soldiers surfaced all around us. It was like fighting ghosts. They would appear, shoot, and vanish. We couldn't hit them because they were underwater most of the time. The worst part was realizing we were completely exposed. We were on rafts with no cover. They could see us, but we couldn't see them. It was the most one-sided fight I ever experienced. The company commander, Captain James Harrington, radioed for air support and artillery. But he couldn't provide target coordinates. The enemy positions were in the river. Bombing the river wouldn't accomplish anything. Artillery would be equally useless. Harrington made the decision to abort the crossing and withdraw. Charlie Company retreated, leaving their dead behind, unable to recover bodies from the middle of the river where Viet Cong soldiers might still be waiting beneath the surface. After the August 17th ambush, American military intelligence launched an intensive investigation to understand how the Viet Cong had conducted an attack from underwater positions. They interviewed survivors. They conducted reconnaissance of the ambush site. They studied photographs and attempted to identify enemy positions. What they discovered was the system of underwater platforms, breathing tubes, and camouflaged firing positions. American engineers were brought in to assess whether such a system could actually work. The engineers were skeptical at first. Remaining underwater for hours while breathing through a bamboo tube seemed impossible. Firing weapons effectively after surfacing from underwater seemed impractical. But tests conducted by Navy SEALs proved that the system worked. SEALs were able to remain submerged in murky water for extended periods using improvised breathing tubes. They were able to fire weapons accurately within seconds of surfacing. The Viet Cong hadn't invented anything technologically sophisticated. They had simply adapted local materials and Vietnamese soldiers' familiarity with water to create a tactical advantage that American forces had never anticipated. American intelligence assessed that underwater combat positions existed at multiple river crossing points throughout the Mekong Delta. They estimated that several hundred Viet Cong soldiers had been trained in underwater combat techniques. The American response, the U.S. military developed countermeasures to underwater combat positions, though none were entirely effective. Underwater detection. Sonar equipment was deployed to detect underwater platforms and structures. But the equipment was designed for detecting submarines, not wooden platforms in shallow rivers. It had limited effectiveness in the murky, debris-filled waters of the Mekong Delta. Pre-crossing bombardment. Artillery and airstrikes were used to bombard river crossing points before American troops attempted to cross. The theory was that this would kill or dislodge any Viet Cong positioned underwater. In practice, soldiers could simply abandon their positions during bombardment and return afterward. Underwater swimmers. Navy SEALs and combat divers were used to scout river crossing points before main forces attempted to cross. This was more effective, but it was time-consuming and required specialized personnel that weren't always available. Alternative crossing methods. Helicopter insertion became preferred over river crossings. If you could fly over the river, you didn't have to deal with whatever might be hidden in it. But helicopters weren't always available and were vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. The most common response was simply avoiding river crossings whenever possible. American commanders became reluctant to order operations that required crossing rivers in the Mekong Delta. This gave the Viet Cong tactical control over large areas of terrain. The Viet Cong expansion encouraged. By the success of underwater combat positions, Colonel Hugh expanded the program. By late 1966, underwater positions were being used not just for ambushes, but for ongoing defense of strategic locations. The Viet Cong constructed permanent underwater fortifications in key rivers and canals. These fortifications included underwater bunkers with air pockets where soldiers could rest between attacks, concealed supply caches stored in waterproof containers on the riverbed communication, lines running underwater to coordinate multiple positions, escape tunnels that allowed soldiers to move from water positions to land. Positions without surfacing, these fortifications turned sections of the Mekong Delta into water fortresses that American forces couldn't easily assault. The only way to clear them was with massive firepower that destroyed the entire area, including civilian infrastructure. But such destruction was politically unacceptable. The Vietnam War was being fought, at least in theory, to protect South Vietnamese civilians. Destroying villages and infrastructure to eliminate underwater Viet Cong positions would undermine the entire strategic purpose of American presence in Vietnam. The psychological dimension, the psychological impact of underwater combat positions extended far beyond the specific ambushes where they were used. American soldiers throughout the Mekong Delta became paranoid about water. Every river crossing became psychologically stressful. Soldiers would scan the water for breathing tubes, for ripples, for any sign of hidden enemies. The constant vigilance was exhausting. Some soldiers reported having nightmares about being attacked by enemies who emerged from water. Others developed phobias about rivers and refused to enter water even when ordered. The Viet Cong understood this psychological dimension and exploited it. They would sometimes position breathing tubes in rivers where no soldiers were actually present. American patrols would discover the tubes, assume they marked enemy positions, and call in airstrikes or artillery on empty locations. This psychological warfare was as effective as the actual combat operations. American forces expended enormous resources attacking phantom threats. They avoided entire areas because they believed underwater positions existed, even when they didn't. Colonel Hugh later described this as making the Americans afraid of their own shadows, or in this case, afraid of water itself. The Battle of Can Gio, the most significant engagement involving underwater combat positions, occurred in November 1966 at Can Gio, a strategic port in the Mekong Delta. American and South Vietnamese forces launched Operation Crimson Tide, a large-scale assault designed to clear Viet Cong forces from the area. The operation involved over 2,000 American soldiers, naval support, and air cover. The plan required crossing several rivers and canals to reach the main Viet Cong positions. American commanders were aware that underwater positions might exist, but they believed that with sufficient firepower and naval support, they could overcome them. They were wrong. The Viet Cong had constructed an entire network of underwater fortifications throughout the waterways around Can Gio. Over 200 soldiers were positioned underwater at various crossing points, supported by tunnels and bunkers that allowed them to move without surfacing. As American forces attempted to cross the waterways, they were engaged from multiple directions by Viet Cong emerging from the water. Naval vessels providing support couldn't effectively target underwater positions. Artillery was useless against enemies that could simply submerge to avoid fire. The operation became a disaster. American forces were pinned down at several crossing points. They couldn't advance without crossing water, and crossing water meant walking into ambushes they couldn't effectively counter. After 3 days, Operation Crimson Tide was called off. American forces withdrew, having accomplished none of their objectives. Casualties were 47 killed and 123 wounded. It was one of the most significant tactical defeats American forces suffered in the Mekong Delta. The intelligence breakthrough in December 1966. American forces captured a Viet Cong soldier who had been trained in underwater combat positions. Under interrogation, he revealed the full extent of the system, how it worked, where positions were located, how soldiers were trained. This intelligence was crucial. For the first time, American commanders understood exactly what they were facing. They could develop specific countermeasures targeted at the actual vulnerabilities of the system. The soldier revealed that the biggest weakness of underwater positions was duration. Soldiers couldn't remain underwater indefinitely. After 6 to 8 hours, they had to surface for rest, regardless of whether Americans were present. He also revealed that breathing tubes were difficult to disguise perfectly. Close inspection could identify them, especially if you knew what to look for. Armed with this intelligence, American forces began conducting sustained surveillance of suspected crossing points. They would watch areas for 24 hours, waiting for Viet Cong soldiers to surface for rest. When soldiers surfaced, they would be engaged by snipers or quick reaction forces. This tactic was more effective. Several underwater positions were discovered and destroyed using this method. But it was resource-intensive, requiring constant surveillance that American forces didn't have the manpower to maintain everywhere. By mid-1967, underwater combat positions became less effective as American forces adapted their tactics. River crossings were conducted less frequently. When they were necessary, extensive reconnaissance and bombardment preceded them. Special forces would scout underwater before main forces crossed. Additionally, the Viet Cong faced their own challenges with the system. Training soldiers for underwater combat was time-consuming. Casualty rates among underwater positions were high. Soldiers who were discovered had no escape route. Equipment degraded quickly in the harsh conditions of the Mekong Delta. Most importantly, the strategic situation was changing. By late 1967, American forces had established greater control over the Mekong Delta. The Viet Cong were shifting to different tactics, including the preparations for the Tet Offensive in 1968. Underwater combat positions didn't disappear entirely, but they became less common. They were used opportunistically rather than as a systematic defensive strategy. The legacy. The underwater combat positions of the Viet Cong represent one of the most innovative tactical developments of the Vietnam War. They demonstrated that low-tech solutions properly applied could counter high-tech military forces. The positions succeeded not because of superior weapons or training, but because they exploited a gap in American tactical thinking. American soldiers were not prepared to fight enemies positioned in water. Once that gap was identified and exploited, American forces struggled to respond effectively. Modern military forces study the underwater positions as examples of asymmetric warfare. They're taught in special operations schools as case studies in tactical innovation. They demonstrate that in warfare, assumptions about where enemies can be positioned are often the most dangerous assumptions to make. The survivors' testimony decades after the war. American veterans who had encountered underwater Viet Cong positions described lasting psychological effects. Private David Miller, who had survived the August 17th ambush, described in a 2005 interview, "I still can't look at rivers without feeling a sense of dread. It's been almost 40 years, but I remember that moment when the water started shooting at us. The feeling of total helplessness, the realization that we were fighting an enemy we couldn't see or predict. People who weren't there don't understand. They think of Vietnam as jungle warfare, but for those of us who operated in the Delta, it was water warfare. And the Viet Cong controlled the water in ways we could never match." Colonel Hyo, the Viet Cong commander who had developed the system, was interviewed after the war as well. He expressed pride in the tactical innovation but also acknowledged its limitations. The underwater positions worked because Americans didn't expect them, but they were never a decisive weapon. They delayed American operations. They inflicted casualties. They created fear, but they didn't win the war. What they did accomplish was demonstrating that Vietnamese soldiers, with minimal resources, could innovate ways to fight that the world's most powerful military couldn't easily counter. That was perhaps more important than any specific tactical victory. The technical analysis military engineers have analyzed the Viet Cong underwater positions to understand their effectiveness and limitations. The system worked because it exploited specific environmental conditions in the Mekong Delta. Murky water that prevented visual detection of underwater structures. Shallow depths, 3-4 feet, that allowed soldiers to stand while remaining submerged. Dense vegetation that concealed breathing tubes. Humid climate that prevented breathing. Tubes from drying out and becoming brittle in different environments. The system wouldn't have worked. Clear water would have revealed the positions. Deep water would have required soldiers to swim rather than stand. Dry climates would have degraded the bamboo tubes. This demonstrates an important principle. Tactical innovations are often environment-specific. What works in the Mekong Delta might not work elsewhere. The Viet Cong's genius was in developing tactics perfectly suited to their specific operational environment. The American soldiers who froze in shock when the river began shooting back learned a lesson that military forces have had to learn repeatedly throughout history. The enemy is wherever the enemy chooses to be. For centuries, rivers were treated as obstacles or boundaries. They were things you crossed, defended, or used for transportation. They were not battlefields in themselves. The Viet Cong changed that. They turned rivers into fortresses. They turned water into cover. They turned the simple act of crossing a river into a complex military operation fraught with psychological terror. The underwater combat positions were used for less than 2 years as a major tactical system, but their impact lasted far longer. They forced American forces to completely rethink how they approached riverine operations. They demonstrated that, in asymmetric warfare, the side with less resources can still innovate in ways that create significant tactical advantages. Today, the rivers of the Mekong Delta flow peacefully. The wooden platforms have long since rotted away. The bamboo breathing tubes have disappeared. The soldiers who once waited underwater for hours, breathing through narrow tubes, preparing to surface and fire at unsuspecting Americans, have either died or grown old. But the memory remains. The memory of the day when American troops discovered that in Vietnam, even the rivers were enemy territory. When they learned that the Viet Cong could attack from anywhere, even from beneath the water itself. Private David Miller described it best. In Vietnam, we learned that there was no safe ground. The jungle wasn't safe. The villages weren't safe. And as we discovered, even the rivers weren't safe. The Viet Cong had figured out how to make everything dangerous. That was their real innovation. Not any specific tactic, but the ability to make us afraid of everything. On August 17, 1966, American troops froze in shock when the river began shooting back. That shock, that moment of realizing that the battlefield was larger and stranger than they had imagined, defined much of the American experience in Vietnam. The river didn't shoot back because of magic or supernatural forces. It shot back because Vietnamese soldiers had figured out how to hide in water and turn it into a weapon. That's the legacy of the underwater combat positions. Not supernatural. Not even particularly high-tech. Just brilliant tactical innovation that exploited enemy assumptions and turned a natural feature, water, into a strategic asset. The Viet Cong made the rivers of Vietnam their allies, and when American troops encountered that alliance, they discovered that in war, the battlefield is defined not by terrain but by imagination. And the Viet Cong had more imagination than American planners had anticipated.